Welcome, and thank you for coming. I hope I can entertain you or amuse you or inform you for the next hour. So I'm going to take you on a journey from realism to hyperrealism, and it's going to be a critical journey in some respects. I'm going to be looking at two sides of an argument or several sides of an argument. I leave you to decide, which side you like or which side you side with. It's a kind of chronological journey I'm going to take you on. So I'm going to be looking at 19th century realism and the way it changed, the way it worked through into socialist realism and realism in the 40s and 50s into the contemporary age. And I'm starting with a quizzical image by René Magritte. It's called The Treachery of Images, and it's in the Los Angeles County Museum. The thing about images, as Magritte has noticed here, is that they are treacherous. You think you know what this subject is. It's obviously a pipe. But he says, no, it's not. It's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. So this is the first difference between words and images. And even artists get confused between what is a painting and what is a painting about, and what are words and what are words able to do. Paintings are always talked about in words, but they're not necessarily about words. There are things which are purely painterly, things which are to do with colors and forms and shapes. And Magritte here is really putting his finger on an ongoing problem for us, the public, for us looking at pictures. What are we looking at? Is it a figure? Is it a nude? Is it something shocking? Or is it a picture of a figure, a picture of a nude, a picture of something shocking? What are we shocked at? Are we shocked at the actual image, the actual paint? Or are we shocked by the idea that the painter had behind or before he started painting? So this ambiguity about what it is that we're actually seeing and how our brains can kind of decode it, make sense of it, is something to do with this puzzle. When the Surrealists introduced their new kind of painting and sculptures in the 1920s, the very name surrealism intends to go beyond realism. Magritte was acutely aware of the different possibilities and the verbal limits of art and painting, respectively. Earlier, when Cézanne had criticized, albeit with a certain admiration, Monet's glittering technique, it was because Monet was only an eye. But my God, what an eye. So Cézanne is looking at Monet, and he has an admiration for his skill, for his painterliness, for the colors, for the light that he's painting with. But for Cézanne, there's something missing in Monet. And what's missing is the kind of intellection, perhaps some kind of conceptual aspect. The argument might be that for Cézanne, Monet looks, he sees a red, he paints a red. He sees a yellow, he paints a yellow. He sees a green, he paints a green. The brain is perhaps not too engaged in critical thinking. This would be Cézanne's perspective, I think. When Cézanne is painting a tree, he sees the tree, but he does something to it in his head. He takes it apart. He sees it as geometry. He reconstructs it in some way. He filters it. He does something and then makes a decision on the canvas, which really has nothing very much to do with the tree. So it's a kind of coding process, which is what Cézanne called the logic of organized sensations. So it's maybe not a fair comment for Monet, because of course Monet is also a thinking person, but I'm putting it here just as a kind of criticism of realism from Cézanne's point of view. Realism isn't enough for Cézanne. Painting has to be about something different, something constructive, something analytical. Sorry, okay, yeah. So here we have Cézanne, and Cézanne's kind of realism is quite different. In this particular picture, done in a very few colors, all the varying colors of the world have been coded and limited to maybe just yellow, red, blue, and green. There's only 4 or 5 colors in the picture, and yet 4 or 5 colors are enough to make a synthetic vision of the world, which is quite convincing. It's not about photography, it's not a photographic depiction, it's quite a conceptual depiction. And in fact, it's very conceptual, because if we can see on the melon point here, in actual fact, it's quite difficult to work out where the light and shade is coming from. There seems to be a shadow, but the shadow seems to go all around the objects. It's not just underneath. This isn't painting from a traditional perspective or from a Renaissance sort of luminosity. The objects are depicted as coming from the back and going to the front and then going back to the back again. And if we could make out a light, it may be that there's a light source hitting the top of the apple, hitting the top of the melon. The light may be coming down like this. It's not exactly clear. So then, what is this? That would normally be a highlight, the point where the light is the brightest on the picture. But in fact, as I've said, the light is really hitting the top. So this is a conceptual highlight. It's the point nearest the eye. It's not the brightest point of the melon in terms of optics. That would be somewhere else. Cézanne is trying to work out a sculptural vision of this melon. He knows it's round in his head, and he's looking at it, and he's trying to depict it as round. The light helps to some degree, but in actual fact, the blank paper represents the point of purest whiteness in the picture. There is nothing else really as white as this point, and it works as a signifier of the point nearest your eye, from which you can navigate to the back of the melon. So it's quite a different kind of observation that Cézanne is doing. So Cézanne has been critical of realism in some sense and come up with his own alternative to it, which is a kind of conceptual analytic painting. Magritte is critical of realism and the surrealists in a way because they want to go beyond realism. So what was realism? Well, in the 19th century, realism had developed for specific reasons and with specific aims. In the literature of Balzac, Zola, and Flaubert in France, and with Henry James and Mark Twain in the USA, realism was a kind of narrative which was rooted in social history. So for Zola, realism wasn't just about depicting real events. It was about depicting particular events, historical events, class struggle, the position of the poor, etc. There was a social aspect to his realism. It was rooted in empirical observation, but it was often directed by a social or a political agenda. So it's not just to tell the story of a particular class, but to show, by telling a story, a kind of historical narrative. The exposure of inequality, class division, or the criticism of the ruling classes, their customs and their worldview. In the novels of Dickens, for example, realism as social observation and moral critique is highlighted. So what you get in Dickens is a depiction of life surrounding him in Victorian England, but it's rendered into a kind of caricature. His characteristics are exaggerated, characters are made typical of certain types, and the narrative takes place in a kind of imaginary world which is halfway between the reality on the streets and the fiction of a novel. Sometimes there's a nod to sentiment and caricature. So in all of these examples, realism is able to function as a kind of critique because it focuses on social inequality existing right now in the present. It does not directly offer an alternative for the future, but it does align itself with the new politics of socialism, which is growing from the 1850s onwards. So Dickens isn't exactly a socialist, but he's aware of social inequalities, and his novels are about pointing out these inequalities through the caricature aspect of his novels. In painting, Courbet's realism had a similar but more directly political intention. Courbet was a lifelong socialist and a friend of the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. In fact, he died in exile because of his involvement in the revolutions of 1871 in Paris. And in the most archetypical picture of Courbet's realism, the Stonebreakers, which now I'm afraid has been destroyed. It was destroyed in the war in Dresden. But it's a really emblematic picture of Courbet's type of realism. It depicts extreme physical labor. And in fact, we quickly empathize with these two figures. They're doing something really hard and really difficult and really painful. The boy is lifting a stone which seems far too big for him. If he continues to do this, it's going to cause him harm. So the idea is that the boy is working too hard, the man is working too hard, their job is endless and tough. Their faces are averted, so we can't see their pain, we can't see their expressions. We can only identify with them as types, as kinds of people, as laborers, as workers. They become characteristic of this type of labor. Even the paint that Courbet is using, the materially loaded paint, he works it thick and trowel-like. It comes to embody, in a way, a kind of political metaphor for his materialist perspective. Matter is primary. Spirit is an illusory distraction. You get this too in his very proletarian painting of the burial at Ornans. The figures represented are local peasant types. They're rough in their faces. They're not sophisticated Parisians. Courbet is empathizing with the ordinary people, if you like. Hungarian philosopher and critic Lukács here in 1932 wrote a lot about realism, and one of the ideas behind his realism was that for him, realism was to provide an image of reality in which the oppositions of appearance and essence, of the individual case and the general rule, of the immediacy of the senses and abstract conceptualism are resolved. So realism functions, you base your art on reality, but you're not just passively reflecting it, you're trying to find the essence of reality through sort of typecasting, if you like, trying to find a particular type of person or a type of action or a type of situation which comes to stand in or embody a particular real situation. So it's a conceptualization from reality, standing in as a kind of typology. A successful realist work, he felt, should dissolve the oppositional elements into a spontaneous whole, presenting an inseparable unity to the reader or the viewer, and therefore suggesting a kind of comforting resolution of the inequalities and contradictions of the present capitalist world. The message of realism was to show that there is an alternative to the present. It need not always be like this. So we're born into a particular society, we think of it as normal. Realism says it may not be normal, there may be an alternative. And through depicting types of action and types of people, perhaps we can lead to a vision of a different future, a different possibility. For Zhdanov and Bukharin in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the aim of socialist realism was to go beyond the naturalism of Zola, which merely reflected or critiqued the inequalities of social reality, and instead to intimate a new socialist reality which they felt was being born. For Cézanne and many of the modernist artists, however, the direct expression of a political view or a political content or even verbal ideas inside painting was felt to be extraneous to what painting was about. For Cézanne, painting was like music. It wasn't like words. It operated through formal and metaphoric means. It was symphonic or rhapsodic or lyrical. In his later years, Cézanne warned the coterie of young artists who gathered around him in Aix to avoid slipping into literary or philosophical speculation. A painter must beware of the literary spirit, which so often causes the painter to deviate from his path, which is the concrete study of nature, to lose himself too long in intangible speculation. So Cézanne here is countering a kind of literary view of art. For Cézanne, the job of the painter is to go out into nature, forget, if you like, most things that he has seen, and try and see nature afresh. Try and find a new way to depict nature, which is to do with observation and analysis. This is Zhdanov, who was in charge of the Common Form in 1947 and directed. He was the sort of person behind socialist realism in Moscow. Historically, the main ambition of painting and sculpture since the Middle Ages has been the ever-increasing mastery of techniques which enable the artist to mirror or in some way imitate the appearance of objects and spaces in the visual world. There is, however, a difference between intention as well as of degree between representation and realism. Cave painting is recognizably representational. if you look at this picture of a man, a bison, and a bird, we can actually make out, we can see that, okay, that on the right, that's a depiction of a bison. We can see that there's a human figure lying on its back. We can see a bird. There's enough information there for us to recognize that these are depictions of things that we know. It's recognizably representational, but it's not realistic. So representation and realism are not the same. With Egyptian art, even if the codes of representation are different to our current codes, again, we can still recognize there's a tree, there's a pond, there's a boat, there's a figure, but their spatial arrangement is not the same as ours. It's not based on a Western perspective. It's not a photographic view. The trees are laid out flat around the four sides of a pond. A square represents a lake seen from above. Figures are represented with a frontal torso and faces side on and in profile. There's enough visual and conceptual information or clues for us to be able to decode the image and understand what is being depicted. So this is a kind of conceptual realism. The artist chooses the most typical or the easiest to understand view of whatever he's depicting. So to understand a lake for an Egyptian, it would make no sense to show the lake horizontal because you would only see one bit of it. So the best way to understand a lake is to look at it from above. Ditto, to understand a tree, you see it in silhouette. So this is about a conceptualizing of the optical and a recoding of it to make it into a most conceptually convincing and depiction. It's not to do with realism as such. The stunning achievement of Hellenistic sculpture represents a pinnacle, perhaps unsurpassable in the history of art, over the mastery over representation. Praxiteles' work here, even seen through the distorted lens of Roman copies, is unparalleled in its sheer tactile perfection. As contemporary commentators were aware, both Pliny the Elder and Lucian narrate the various phenomena that this sculpture gave rise to. Characteristics like thambos or stupor, which the statue of Aphrodite at Knidos inspired. There are stories of people falling in love with the statue, of locking themselves into the temple at night so that they could be with her. There's a whole kind of cult of admiration for this sculpture, which gave rise to a whole category of concepts in aesthetics. Okay, is it not recording? Okay, sorry. I can hear it hissing sometimes. So, yeah. In painting, excuse me, Zeuxis was so famed for his skills in depiction, so the story goes, that he even fooled birds with his paintings of grapes. So in this Dutch engraving, you get the painting by Zeuxis here, which shows the Cupid with the grapes, and a real bird has come down and seen the grapes and is trying to pick them. There's a kind of competition between Zeuxis and Parrhasios. Zeuxis challenged Parrhasios to do better than him. He said, look at me, my painting is so convincing that even the birds are fooled. They really think these are real grapes. So Parrhasios went away and did his painting and asked Zeuxis to come back. Zeuxis comes back and finds a curtain over the painting of Parrhasios. So he goes up to try and draw the curtain aside, and then he realizes he's been tricked. The curtain is painted. So the illusion is total, and Zeuxis has to say, well, yes, you fooled me, therefore you win, because fooling a bird is not as hard as fooling a human. So this is the famous story of Zeuxis and Parrhasios. Even in the 17th century, the painting of grapes was one of the trials or tests that an art student had to undergo to qualify as a master painter. So the Dutch artists actually took this model as a proof that you could be an artist. If you could paint grapes illusionistically, then okay, you were an artist. The discovery of startlingly lifelike classical art, like the statue of Aphrodite there in the 15th century, following the archaeological excavations in Rome, was one of the main drivers for the Italian Renaissance, jolting it out of its medieval symbolic abstractions and encouraging a newfound fascination with empirical observation and scientific method. The idea that you could finally codify the three-dimensional world in 2 dimensions in a scientific and rational way. Piero della Francesca was one of the earliest artists to adopt this precision tool for creating a perfectly organized rational space, organized around a particular single viewpoint where every plane on every surface can be calculated mathematically from a fixed viewpoint. Leonardo observed that painting is only about surfaces, surfaces which reflect light and therefore color. So this again is to do with empirical observation. The painter just has to look and look hard, and everything is possible through vision. The end of any color is only the beginning of another, and it ought not to be called a line, for nothing interposes between one color and another except the termination of the one against the other, which, being nothing in itself, cannot be perceivable. So this is even a definition of Impressionism, if you like, from Leonardo, that the optical world as depicted by the artist is just made up of colored surfaces. There's no such thing as a line. A line is an abstraction. It doesn't exist in nature. All that you have is one color ends and another color begins. And the painter just has to observe these changes for him to depict reality. In fact, all the artist has to do is reflect the light catching on various textured surfaces of the three-dimensional world. That's all that we can see, and that's all that the artist can paint. We can't paint the backs of things because we can't see them. We can only paint the fronts. And it's precisely this clarity of surface which appears in Caravaggio. This is the entombment of Christ in the Pinacoteca Vaticana, 1602. In Caravaggio, every surface is depicted with a clarity and a spatial precision. There is nothing ambiguous in a Caravaggio. Your eye, almost like a fly crawling over the surface, can move from one finger to another, from the finger to the arm, from the arm to the shoulder. Every single part of it is articulated. There is no ambiguity about where something might be. And then the whole structure is organized. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. Is organized from this central point. It's almost like a puppet holding a string. The hand sweeps you down in a series of descending curves, finally to the blackness of the tomb. So the physical structure of the painting tells you the subject of the painting. The entombment is a descent. It's a descent from the light to the dark. And it's a descent made dramatic by this posing of the four figures on a stage which juts out or seems to come forward into our space, thus including us in the picture. Caravaggio was so clear and so precise in his spatial organization that he gave rise to a whole school of the Caravaggeschi, and after him the Caravaggeschi in Rome, Naples, France, and the Low Countries and Spain continued his tradition. Whether it be José Ribera, Georges de la Tour, or Gerrit van Honthorst here, who managed in some instances to approximate the clarity of Caravaggio's achievements, they never really surpass him. Another aspect of Caravaggio which ties him to the modern period is his empirical truthfulness in depicting the direct material characteristics of the everyday, because they were observed with such focus and honesty. The specific way a drape falls from a bed or a curtain rail, the pasty surface of skin, whether the rough complexion of the ordinary subjects he used as models or the dead surface of a corpse, the sharp gleam of a sword point, or the heavy materiality of leather or felt. There's something very physical about the descriptions that Caravaggio gives to his surfaces. They still seem real to us 400 years later. Go backwards. This desire for a dramatic effect, an utterly convincing depiction, develops into the Baroque period a taste for trompe-l'œil, or deceiving the eye into believing that the man-made version is in fact the real. Such artfulness, with its illustrative skill and sensationalist effects, moves art towards craft, and in fact is the opposite of Caravaggio's project, and much closer to the hyperrealism that Umberto Eco discusses on his road trip around the USA. This is because the focus of this kind of hyperrealism is on the superficial detail and the appearance of the real. In other words, it's an imitation or a representation, rather than the reality being invoked by the formal resolution of a pictorial or sculptural whole. So there's a kind of difference between representation, which is a kind of passive imitation of the world, and a presentation. So I would argue that realism, when it gets too obsessed with tricking the eye, becomes a kind of imitation of life. And where it becomes more synthetic and recodes life in some way, then it is a presentation of life. So there's a difference between representation and presentation in art. Cézanne and Caravaggio are about presentation. The imitation tries to convince us that it is more real than reality. The artwork presents us with a compelling but different, because pictorially encoded, reality. So this is at the heart of Cézanne's criticism of Monet. Monet was too passively imitating reality. Cézanne thinks that you should do something more and reconstruct reality in some way. Here we have a Baroque sculpture by Pedro da Mena, the Mater Dolorosa. In this picture, the intense preoccupation with veracity takes extreme forms. The artist has actually included real hairs into the eyelashes, which were inserted into the face. Ivory teeth are presented behind the lips, and glass eyes are glued into position behind the delicately modeled and beautifully carved wooden face. So this is carved out of wood, but it has real hair for the eyebrows and eyelashes, animal hair, glass eyes, and ivory teeth, to make it seem even more real than what was possible by normal sculptural means. And in fact, you might just see on the cheeks, there are actual glass tears glued onto the surface of the skin, and a little trail of glue which goes from the eye over the cheek. And when you move your head, you can see it glistening, as if the path of the tear, you can actually follow the path of the tear from the eye to the cheek. All of this is minute attention to detail, is to really convince you that this is real. This is not a depiction. This is actually the Madonna. It has a religious function to convince you even more. And this religious function comes from St. John of the Cross. The use of images has been ordained by the Church for two principal ends, namely, that we may reverence the saints in them, and that the will may be moved and devotion to the saints be awakened by them. When they serve this purpose, they are beneficial, and the use of them is necessary, and therefore we must choose those that are the most true and lifelike, and the most move the will to devotion. So there's a direct correlation between a quantitative realism, how much realism there can be, with how convincing these statues will be to make you more religious. So the more realistic, the more religious effect they will have. The descent into religious and historical kitsch starts from this anxiety, the anxiety to deceive believers and give them proof of the veracity of the fake. And Umberto Eco, who has written about hyperrealism in his book, which I showed briefly there, talks about the same kind of wish to convince you of the truth of a copy in things like the Lyndon B. Johnston Memorial Library. The actual desk of Lyndon B. Johnson is reproduced. Documents that Lyndon B. Johnson might have signed are reproduced. And the texts are explaining to you that this is really what Lyndon B. Johnson signed. This is really where he sat. This is really his book. In fact, they're all copies, and they're meant to convince you more than the originals, which are probably faded and lost, would do. This tradition of trickery, if you like, a focus on trickery and illusionism, links art, or even converts artistry into ingenuity. It continues into the 18th century with clockwork automata, and here is one by Pierre-Jacques Droz. It's a series of 3 automata in Neuchâtel. And this one is called The Writer, but there were 3. There was the writer, the draftsman, and the musician. So they're very elaborate clockwork mechanisms, clothed. They're about half-life size, and they're, in a way, pre-programmed. There's a clockwork program which permits the arms and the hands and the eyes and the head to move in synchronized movements. And you can actually program this sculpture, this mannequin, to write up to 40 characters. So his pen will dip into real ink, move onto real paper, and move, and his eye will follow what he's writing. And he's actually writing a text which you can literally pre-program into the back of his clockwork mechanism, and he will then write the text that you want him to write. This statue is able to write any 40-character text pre-programmed by means of a series of cogs using real quill and ink on paper. He moves his head, his hands, and his eyes as he writes. He is a precursor to the animatronic robots which Echo observes in Pirate Island in Disneyland. The many debates between realism and naturalism in art have played out ever since this battle between illusion and reality, whether art should present or whether art should represent an illusion. Should it present a conclusion or represent an illusion? The aspect of trompe-l'œil, deceiving the eye, appears intermittently in art ever since Zeuxis's day. But if we're honest with ourselves, perhaps it rings rather hollow, like a sideshow. Art like this is perhaps skillful and deceptive, humorous maybe, but in a sense not serious. In the 19th century, the Catalan painter Per Borel i del Caso achieved startlingly convincing effects with his highly developed naturalism. And it's undoubtedly well done. We are totally convinced by his depictions, but we understand it as a joke. It is undoubtedly well told, but perhaps we demand more of art than on repeated examination. The something more perhaps lies in the deeper metaphoric level and function of art, which operates through its technique and processes rather than its apparent content. So there's a difference between a painting can have the best will in the world, in a sense. You can will your painting to be about something, but what you actually do is often something quite different. We saw previously how in the 19th century realism either recorded social reality or attempted to change it. Heidegger discussing Van Gogh's pair of boots, and T.J. Clark discussing Courbet's Burial at Ornans, both in their different ways, highlight the way that art physically embodies and constitutes a worldview. What you see is changed by how you see, and vice versa. So I'd like to look now a little bit at a section on figuration versus abstraction. Realism has also been a direct and deliberate tactic by artists and governments alike. We saw that Soviet socialist realism can and has been seen as an ideological opposition to the dominant US mainstream support for abstraction, particularly American abstract abstraction after the Cold War. There's a kind of debate which is now more or less provable that the reason why American art was sponsored, the kind of art that was sponsored was abstract, was because in the Soviet Union, the kind of art that was sponsored was figurative. So if the communist bloc was representing typical workers and families and figurative depictions, then America was showing that it was the land of the free, the big open prairie, the wide open canvas where anything is possible. There's a kind of political debate going in the Cold War between the land of open horizons and improvised art, if you like, an art which isn't known about beforehand, a risk-taking art, a gestural art, and an art which is already prescribed by Zhdanov and the Central Committee. And this becomes a kind of political metaphor which is used in Cold War debates. America uses its abstract artists as kind of propaganda to show that America is the land of the free. The ideological strain then on American abstract expressionism as the sole protector of all Western progressive aesthetic values becomes enormous. Perhaps it's putting too much strain on Jackson Pollock. His kind of art has to stand for all the freedoms of the West, if you like. It's too much to expect from this kind of painting. Critics like Greenberg, Rosenberg, and Rosenblum were eloquently proselytizing for this kind of art and exerting pressures on artists to follow a particular aesthetic line, and it had to be non-figurative. Greenberg actually writes in his Art and Culture in the 1940s, any artist who is not working in an abstract way is basically out of step with the times. There is only one way to work now. We're modern. The future is with abstract art. This was the message that Greenberg was saying in the 40s. The logic was inexorable. There was a clear causal and stylistic line which goes from Giotto to Cézanne, and from Cézanne, who is credited with simplifying art, the progressive modernist line leads inexorably through to American abstract expressionism. It's a kind of unilinear line. You can trace, and even Gombrich does this in his histories, there is one version of art. It goes from influence to influence to influence in a line which zigzags from Giotto through realism, through the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It comes to a fruition with Cézanne, and then Cézanne gives the clue to America. America then carries this line forward. This is traditional Western art history. In effect, there are criticisms of this view as being too simplistic. From abstract expressionism through to hard-edge abstraction and then minimalism, we have a problem. What happens after minimalism? When art has followed a process of simplification, and you end up with a white square and a black box, what can you do next? What is the second minimalist sculpture that you can make once you've reduced sculpture to the absolute minimum? Peter Fuller has called this the kenosis of art, the emptying out or the draining of meaning of modern art. As the formal means become larger and more reductive, the paintings get bigger, the gestures get larger, they strained increasingly to convey extraneous content. After the absolute reductiveness of minimalism in the 1960s, there were only two alternatives, it seemed, for art. Art must become more complex, and it must follow a conceptual direction, or it must return to figuration. So once you've hit the kind of, not exactly a dead end, but once you've hit the point of minimalism, what do you do next? So there's two options. You return to figuration, or you go conceptual. This seems to be the pivoting point, seems to be minimalism in the 60s. The return to figuration was personified by, this is minimalism and Don Judd, so it's a process of simplification that you can see from Cézanne, who is simplifying his picture into a series of planes and colors, right through to Don Judd, who ends up presenting you with something very, very direct and geometrical. The turning point really comes in Philip Guston, this return to figuration. He was already a successful abstract painter who altered his style dramatically around 1967 from a lyrical abstract expressionism on the left to a proto-pop figurative neo-expressionism on the right. So there's a startling change in Philip Guston around 1950, and in a way, for me, it's motivated by this crisis of minimalism, because you can carry on making this kind of painting for quite a while. You get into a kind of gestural repetition, if you like. You can do a red one, you can do a blue one. In a way, the ingredients are so little that ultimately it kind of runs out of steam. And for Philip Guston, he made an absolute decision to change completely and recomplicate his work by putting in figuration. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. There are, of course, multiple parallel contradictory trajectories in art. Within Britain, figurative artists such as Hugo here, Leon Kossoff, Frank Auerbach, Lucian Freud, Jenny Saville, Stephen Conroy, and many more, are of course following a different route. So the history books generally follow this line, that there's a clear line from Cézanne to minimalism. After minimalism, there's a bifurcation towards a return to figuration or a move towards conceptualism. But in England and in France and other places, of course, artists carried on working figuratively. Ewan Uglow is an artist who is taking up the kind of mission of Cézanne to only paint from observation, but to try and deconstruct reality and reconstruct it as a picture. And of course, in pop art, as with Tom Vesselman here, the lessons of abstract painting have then been readopted into a new kind of figuration, a post-minimalist pop figuration. Warhol's Death and Disaster and Skulls show that pop art is not just about consumerism and about celebrating the market, but also, with Warhol, has a kind of darker side. So to photorealism. Photorealism was the term was first used by Louise K. Meisel in 1968 in the catalogue of a Whitney show, which included the work of 22 realists. Photorealism was seen as developing out of pop art in the mid-60s and 70s, and it shared certain concerns with the mundane world of shop windows and polished trucks, urban landscapes and everyday objects. Artists such as Malcolm Morley, Claudio Bravo, Robert Brechtley, Chuck Close, Robert Cottingham, there are many of them. They're working with analog photography, and even the format of the 35mm film or 35mm slide gives rise to the shape and proportions of their canvases. So they take as their subject not the outer world that Cézanne would look at, but the mediated world of the photograph. So there's a debate about when Chuck Close is painting a figure, is he painting a figure or is he painting a photograph of a figure? Is this a portrait of Chuck Close or is this a portrait of a two-dimensional surface of a photograph? When he's being true to what he sees, he's being true to the photograph, not to Chuck Close. Chuck Close is more interesting than many of the photorealists because he uses this transcriptive process to actually see how far he can go away from traditional imitation and actually construct with a new kind of proto-pixelation. This is before digital cameras. Someone like Richard Estes is generally, his works generally consist of carefully composed city landscapes. They're noted for their stillness, their geometry. Very often they're a double square. Usually there's an axis more or less down the middle. There's a strong emphasis on the illusory perspective, the flatness of the canvas and the reflections in the mirrors. It's his typical theme. They generally lack human figures or depictions of human figures, and characteristically their obsessions are with reflections in glass, mirrors, and polished metal surfaces. Although obviously photographic in appearance, their geometry and spatial organization in fact go beyond a passive reflection of the lens. They tidy up or improve upon it. In this sense, they are idealizing rather than realistic, in Eco's distinction. So with photorealism, which is based around the analog camera, you get a predilection for shiny surfaces, windows, mirrors, glassware. Eddie's virtuoso glassware here is a self-imposed challenge to faithfully represent an almost impossible subject. The contrasting linear emphasis and vertiginous perspective recalls some of the work of the American hard-edge abstractionists like Al Held. Audrey Flack, born in 1931, is both a painter and a sculptor, and she celebrates consumer treats such as cakes and pastries, as well as religious kitsch, both Catholic and Indian. In both, there is perhaps an element of consummation, of being consumed by consumption. The large scale and often melting soft focus give her works a gloriously exaggerated feel. In Dolores here, the exuberant spirit and heightened colors echo the Baroque drama that we saw above in Pedro de Mena, inflecting through a particularly Latin American piety even down to the glass tears. A further theme in photorealism, perhaps reflecting what critic Laura Mulvey has termed the voyeuristic aspect of the male gaze, takes the form of a highly fetishized nude, usually female. When painted, as in Philip Bernstein or Joseph Grützke, the distinction between the surface of the photograph and the surface of the skin becomes blurred. When sculpted, as here with John de Andrea, the work assumes a more directly fetishistic character. In sculptures such as The Seated Woman, made from painted polyester and resin, with the addition of real materials such as hair, Andrea continues this Baroque desire for absolute believability, but without any religious motivation. In Eco's terms, Umberto Eco's terms, these are the absolutely false, presented so convincingly as to declare themselves to be absolutely true. They have no ulterior purpose. By their minute attention to detail and their verisimilitude in texture, color, size, and proportion, his sculptures take on an eerily disturbing presence. They continue the tradition which led from the Baroque to the clockwork automata of the 18th century, and eventually, to the amour fou of Pygmalion and the ancient allure of Praxiteles' Aphrodite, which are its true progenitors. De Andrea's work forms a bridge between photorealism and its successor, hyperrealism. So we've seen a development from realism, critique of realism in the surrealists, from realism to photorealism, and now from photorealism to hyperrealism. Just as photorealism develops out of analog photography, the preceding art style of pop art, and the inflationary world of consumer capitalism, so hyperrealism is the product of digital photography, the preceding style of photorealism, and the hyperinflation of neoliberal economics. So there's a kind of parallelism. Photorealism is based on analog photography, pop art, and consumer capital. Hyperrealism now becomes digital photography, photorealist history, and the hyperinflation of neoliberal economics. However, with hyperrealism, something different happens. It's more different in its approach from the more literal and formal trend of photorealist painting and sculpture. Although hyperrealist painters and sculptors also use photographic images as source material, their work, unlike photorealism, is more narrative and emotive. Photorealism tends to imitate the appearance of the photographic image, abstracting or idealizing certain details. In effect, photorealists are painting the surface of the photograph, not what the photograph depicts. They are consequently removed from any emotional narrative or political significance of the depicted subject. Since it evolved from pop art, the photorealistic style of painting was similarly cool, hard-edged, precise, and sharply mechanical, with an emphasis on the mundane, everyday imagery. From its other source, conceptualism, it took a disinterested, mechanical, and extra-personal working procedure. The relationship of photorealism and consequently hyperrealism to pop art is key. And it's Baudrillard in particular sees that pop art is the last great modernist style, after which comes the unbreachable rupture of the postmodern. So Baudrillard is the kind of guru of hyperreality, and he sees in the whole history of art, there's been a development through different movements, but when you get to pop art, something different happens. Pop art for him is a kind of turning point where before you have the whole history of art from Giotto to pop art, and then you have something new which happens with pop art and moves into the future. Whereas all art up to pop was based on a vision of the world in depth, pop art, on the contrary, claims to be homogeneous with the industrial and serial production, and so with the artificial, fabricated character of the whole environment. So for Baudrillard, pop art becomes identified with the world that it's depicting. It's no longer stepping back and looking at the world. It is part of that world. And artists like Peter Halley in America were taking up Baudrillard's texts and finding ways to what they call a kind of simulationist art, an art which presents us with a simulation of reality. In Halley's work, you have kind of iconic depictions of cities and structures. We live in boxes linked by pipes, sewers, electricity, computer lines, etc. They become stylized icons of our present. This is the dilemma of hyperrealism then, the pleasure of imitation and the distractions of technique. Although the term hyperrealism was first coined by a Belgian art dealer, Issy Bracho, in 1973, at the time the show included works by photorealists as well as hyperrealists. To begin with, it wasn't clear that there was a distinction between these different kinds of artists. More accurately, hyperrealism refers to a second wave of artists influenced by the photorealists, and including Charles Bell, Dennis Patterson, Gottfried Helnwein, Elissa Monk, Vesna Bursicht, Ron Mueck, and many more. And what's different between photorealism and hyperrealism is that the latter tend to focus more on details and are able to achieve greater realism, greater meticulousness, because they're using digital cameras. They can zoom in on pixel by pixel and create a much more tight version of reality than the photorealists could do. An artist like Elissa Monk is typically picturing models in water or steam. She develops an extremely sophisticated handling on a grand scale, equal to the earlier photorealists, but these monumental works nevertheless have a kind of intimacy, a bodily experience, and an empathy. Her large-scale nudes are often veiled by layers of transparent steam, water, or glass. Italian artist Vesna Bursicht here is taking the photorealism to a hyper-real next step. So here we have a photorealist depiction of reality, which is then, if you like, crumpled and then redepicted. So this is a hyper-real depiction of a photoreal depiction of a figure. So this is why the hyperrealism takes on an extra level, a subsidiary level from photorealism. There's even been a movement called mega-realism in the 1980s, which takes it even further. And Gottfried Helnwein here is one of the great masters of this hyperrealist style. You can see here his model and the typical way that he inflates the image to a huge scale. And because he's using digital photography, he's able to really literally zoom in pixel by pixel and create a stunningly deceptive view. The attempt to push even further the extents and bounds of photorealist technique can be seen in the Italian artist Vesna Bursicht, born in 1974, in a series of paintings of vacuum-packed, cellophane-wrapped fruits, like a frozen still life, and then through her crumpled portraits of paper, portraits painted on paper which had been crumpled and then unfolded back into the real world. They represent paintings of photographs within paintings, or illusions of illusions in an illusionistic setting. This aspect of hyperrealism can be seen as an inflated reiteration of the trompe-l'œil tradition, which runs from Giuseppe Arcimboldo through the 19th century artists like Pier Borel del Caso and to the paranoid critical realism of surrealist Salvador Dali. But within the tradition of hyperrealism, there's something different which didn't appear in photorealism, and that is a more direct concern with the subject depicted. And someone like Dennis Patterson has a much more political aspect to his pictures. He's using the hyperrealist style to make an utterly convincing depiction, but the subjects are also important to him. He's painting subjects to do with poverty. He was commissioned by UNESCO and by the UN Refugee Agency to provide pictures about the conditions of refugees. So for Dennis Patterson, it's not just about technique. The subject matter is also important. So I would say, to conclude, the difference between Caravaggio's kind of stark realism And the manifold varieties of illusionism which recur through art history lies not so much, I would say, in the manual dexterity or the skills of the artist in tricking us. Caravaggio is able to convincingly depict reality and convince us by his depictions. The more important thing, I think, is in the force of the imagination, which gives a moral force to their technique. Caravaggio's paintings are abstractions recreated after reality. He constitutes or presents us with a reality rather than just representing it. When the technique is subservient to this ambition, as with hyperrealism, as with any other form of representational art, then the artist has space to tell us something about our world. If this is not the case, then the work becomes kitsch. At the end of the day, history has not to be imitated, it has to be made. Thank you.
Since the beginning, the Western realism has been interconnected with the development of new technologies and new optical devices. I wanted to ask, well, do you think, or did the invention and the use of new technologies which enable us to see other reality that we can see with the naked eye, like telescope or microscope, did it influence our understanding of reality and the representations of reality as well?
Sure. The English artist David Hockney has done some research onto the way that depiction has changed over time, and what he did was he cut out depictions of saints' faces over periods, and he put them in a kind of chronological line across his studio wall. So iconic paintings of the 11th century, 12th century, Byzantine paintings, 13th century, and what he noticed was around 1450 suddenly the faces become much more photographic. So he said it's a startling change. The whole history of art, from the beginnings in the Middle Ages, if you like, Western art in the Middle Ages, through to the Renaissance, the artist is doing the best they can to create a convincing illusion, and sometimes the perspective is not quite right, etc. But when it gets to around 1450, suddenly the images become incredibly convincing. And he was convinced that around 1450, developments in optics, Galileo was inventing telescopes, people had lenses, that probably artists were using lenses from about 1450. Vermeer's apartment in Delft, he painted 40 paintings in his life, and all of the paintings really were painted in 2 rooms of an apartment in Delft. And it's probable, says Hockney, that one room was the studio, and between the studio and where he was painting, where you put the models in one room, the next room would be where he was painting, there would be a hole in the wall with a lens in it. So the image would have been, natural light would have flooded through the lens onto like a camera obscura, onto the canvas. The particular photographic quality in Vermeer is, according to Hockney, probably caused by the fact that he was using lenses. So I think you're right. Artists will always use whatever technology is available, and you can see that between photorealism and hyperrealism. Photorealism uses analog photography, the best possible photographs at the time, and they were squaring them up, they were blowing them up, they were minutely studying them with a magnifying glass to try and get minute detail. Now that we've got digital cameras, we can go down and down and down into the pixel level, and it's much easier to blow up a pixel and square up. So I think yes, it's a long answer, but I think yes, there are artists now working with space telescopes and the internet and all these different technologies, and undoubtedly they will give rise to new experimental ways of working. I think that's part of the human curiosity, I think. Thank you for your question.
Okay, it's quite interesting. So we are usually thinking about photographs and paintings and graphic arts and such things, but now it's about picture. Everything, so in hyperrealism it's picture, like not painting or photograph, just picture. Is it really so?
use the word pictures, I suppose, for both painting and photograph. But I think it's something to do with the intentions of the artist and the processes. I have an ambivalent relation to photorealism because as an artist, I was trained in an observational post-Cézanne kind of way where you wouldn't paint from photographs. It was somehow not allowed to paint from photographs, or it was too easy to paint from photographs. The artist had to try and make their own synthesis from life. And Uglo, that I showed, is certainly somebody who believes that. He would never work from a photograph. He would paint for many years one painting, but it was all about direct observation. But I think that, as I was trying to say, that it really depends on your approach. If you're, as an artist, if your sole aim is to imitate the appearance of a photograph, then it's a pretty empty aim, and the painting really becomes about skill and about technique. It may be very amazing, it may be very time-consuming, but it may be not very interesting as a painting. If as a painter you have something to say and something to criticize or some point of view, then I think technique is subservient to that. And I think, like Dennis Patterson, he has something to say, and he's using his technique to say it. Technique isn't the end point. So I think that would be my kind of ambivalence about it.
I have one more question. I think there is something quite romantic in this approach to reality right here. Well, romanticism was about building a new world, creating out of a world like that, for example. So I think it's quite romantic, actually. There's a fascination with reality.
Yes. I mean, it's logical that as people, as artists, we're observing, we're looking all the time. And it's logical to make art about what you see, as that's what art has always been about. So, I think with the move towards abstract art, the inspiration is not so much the outside world, outside the studio, but the inside world of the studio. You make a work of canvas, and that's what you see, and you respond to that by doing something else. So it becomes much more theatrical and much more closed within the studio. But I think developments in digital photography and now access to imagery. We have so much access to imagery through the internet that I think it opens up many ways to work with images, which I think artists are exploring.
Do you have anything you'd like to ask? So I have one last question. I think it would be quite interesting if you could show us something on the board.
That would be another time. I mean, I could do. I can. But how much time do you have? I could point you to a website, and then people could look. Can I get a website here? How do I finish this? If there's internet, I can. Oops. So, this one. Okay, so this is my website. I work in collaboration with my partner, Sita Alagapan, and we're exploring a kind of distributed production. She lives in London, I live in France, and we work together on the same paintings sometimes. She might do one layer and I do another layer, and we're communicating back and forth by Skype, and then we'll spend some time. She comes to France and we work on some pictures. So it's a kind of interesting postmodern kind of existence in a way. We've got some, I'm not sure what's on, this is a relatively new website, so the exhibitions, there's an archive of exhibitions here which people can explore. Sometimes our projects are kind of social projects, working with people, getting people together to do something, create some action. Very often they're collaborative and international. We have projects from Armenia and Spain and America and Berlin and Prague, and we're having artists in different places collaborating on projects around a theme. This one was about neighbours and neighbourliness. We have a series of work which is abstract, which explores the computer chips, which are used to, you'll know these little RFID tags that you find in books or records in shops to stop you stealing them. If you run out of the shop, the alarm goes off because it's got one of these little tags in. So we use these as a kind of symbol of surveillance, of control. This one was in the Bulgarian embassy about the chip inside passports that doesn't allow people to enter Britain because of immigration anxieties. This one was for an art fair, and it's a computer chip created out of Google Maps. So it would close the tape that was used for the work is actually Google Maps with a kind of computer chip. So there's a whole series of works which explores computer chips. This one is made out of marigold petals. And then we've showed quite a lot in Brno and in Prague. So this was a show in Brno of some of these computer chip paintings with a Zen garden made out of shredded documents and rocks, artificial rocks, which were whispering paranoid secrets. So this is also a kind of paranoia, a Kafkaesque kind of paranoia, being watched, being surveilled, being policed. So here's one that we did in the Miro Foundation in Mallorca. And in Tbilisi in Georgia. So there's a lot of these. This is a typical painting that we're working on together of a computer chip. So there's a lot. That's a nice project we did in Skolska in Prague with students and Wojciech Horalek, which had 58 participants from 13 countries and involved a kind of exchange between artists on a theme. The theme was what will happen in the future. It's getting people to contribute works on this theme. Anyway, so there's lots of works there. There's some of the computer chip paintings. This was a big show in Taiwan, which was mostly photographic and film, so that we made some big panoramas in Venice, which are kind of like allegories of aspects of Venetian life. Yeah, this was the project we did in Venice. We were part of the Biennale in 2003 to 4 called Radar. We had one of the pavilions in the 50th Venice Biennale. And it was a project about European integration. So it was about artists going into Venice, working with local people on a number of digital projects, making films, videos, sound works. And then we worked on something like 25 projects in 3 months. And then we exhibited 5 of them at the Biennale. So this is the Biennale. These are some of the panoramas. In fact, they're 10 meter by 1 meter prints, which were created out of hundreds of digital photos, but not using photographic software. These were actually, if you like, hand-stitched on Photoshop, so zooming into the pixels and joining one photo with another photo to make it look like it was one big photo. There's about 200 photos in each one, and they're literally pixel perfect. There's not one join that doesn't work, if you like. So they're allegories of earth, air, fire, and water. And this is an early piece. We were in another Biennale in 1995, where we did a work about tea, the Scottish and Indian fascination and connections between the Indian tea trade in Scotland, between, of course, myself being Scottish and my partner being Indian. So anyway, there's some things there. And then we have our publications, which are also available. And we have various projects. Yeah, every year I run an art festival in France, and I invite artists from all over to come and stay. And we have, my friend Hervé is here in the audience today, being very patient, but he's a regular visitor. And we have a couple of weeks of talking, discussions, exhibiting, doing projects, a lot of cooking and drinking as well, as usual. But it's quite a nice thing. So if anybody is interested in the Lorc Art Festival, then there's a Facebook page about it as well. I'm part of a setup with Joseph Daniek, a virtual academy called the Frozen Academy, which is really a loose collaboration of Czech and other artists doing projects all over the world. We've done about 70 exhibitions with the Frozen Academy. We also have our press, our own press, which publishes catalogues. Our first catalogue was the work of Jiří Havlíček from Brno, my good friend. So, okay. Thank you for being patient.
Thank you. Thank you all.